At 6:45 a.m., the police received a frantic call. The housekeeper, Martha Jenkins, a woman who had worked for the Moores for over a decade, arrived early that morning. What she saw when she opened the heavy oak door to the pastor's study would haunt her forever. Her footsteps echoed through the long corridor as she approached the study. The house was unnaturally quiet. She called out for Pastor Moore, expecting him to already be up and preparing for the day. But no one answered. Something was wrong. When Martha finally reached the study, her hands shook as she grasped the doorknob. The door creaked open, and what lay behind it froze her in place. The room was immaculate, except for the shocking sight in the center of it. Blood splattered across the room's pristine white walls, staining the family portraits that hung like eerie witnesses to the horror. And there, lying on the floor, was Pastor Daniel Moore. His lifeless body was sprawled out, still dressed in his tailored Sunday suit, now soaked in his own blood. The scent of iron filled the air, mixing with the faint smell of freshly brewed coffee still lingering from the kitchen. Martha gasped, her breath hitching in her throat as her knees buckled. The Bible, always sitting neatly on the pastor's desk, was now by his side, blood-stained. Her eyes locked on it, and she saw it. A note, tucked between the blood-smeared pages, clutched in his hands as if in a final prayer. But this was no act of devotion. The words on the note were scrawled hastily, barely legible. "Forgive me, for I have sinned." Martha stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her ears. She dropped her cleaning supplies, which clattered against the hardwood floor as she scrambled for her phone. Her fingers trembled as she dialed 911, her voice barely audible over her panicked breathing. When the first officers arrived, they were struck by the sheer violence of the scene. The floor beneath Pastor Moore's body was slick with blood, his face still contorted in shock or pain. It wasn't long before whispers began to spread through the town. The small, tight-knit community of Briarwood was a place where rumors spread faster than wildfire. Pastor Daniel Moore had always been regarded as a pillar of the community, a man who could do no wrong. But behind closed doors, the truth was much darker. Pastor Moore had carefully crafted his image. In public, he was a charismatic leader, always smiling, always offering a kind word or a prayer. He spoke of forgiveness, family values, and moral integrity. But it was in the quiet moments, when the church was empty and the pews were bare, that his true nature revealed itself. No one would have suspected that Pastor Moore, the same man who preached about purity every Sunday, was hiding a scandalous secret, an affair with a teenage girl. Her name was Emily Harding, an 18-year-old high school senior and regular at the church. She was quiet, unassuming, the kind of girl people barely noticed, but Pastor Moore had noticed her, and over time his attention had turned into something far more dangerous. It started innocently enough, or at least that's what Emily had convinced herself. She had come to him for guidance, as many in the congregation did. Emily's home life wasn't perfect. Her parents were devout but distant, and she had always felt overlooked, as if she didn't quite fit in anywhere. She had admired Pastor Moore from afar for years, his confidence, his presence, the way he seemed to have all the answers. And when he offered her private counseling sessions, she felt special, seen. But what she didn't know was that Moore was a master manipulator. The sessions began with talks about faith, her struggles, her future. He would ask her personal questions, drawing her in, gaining her trust. And Emily, young and naive, never saw the trap being laid. Over time, the boundaries between pastor and parishioner began to blur. The late-night sessions became more intimate, first emotionally, then physically. Pastor Moore knew exactly what to say to make her feel important, needed. He convinced her that their connection was something divine, something beyond the understanding of ordinary people. Emily, eager to please and desperate for approval, believed him. But as the affair deepened, Pastor Moore's control over her grew stronger. He would whisper promises of a future together, a life where they could be free of the judgments of others. He painted a picture of a world where it would be just the two of them. But deep down, Moore knew he could never allow this relationship to see the light of day. He had too much to lose. His position, his reputation, his family, all hung in the balance. What could have driven this young girl into the arms of a man twice her age? And why did Pastor Moore risk everything, his marriage, his career, his reputation for her? But Pastor Moore wasn't as careful as he thought. For weeks, his wife, Susan Moore, had noticed something wasn't right. It was subtle at first. Small, almost insignificant details that nagged at the back of her mind, but were easy to dismiss. But once you start looking for cracks, it's impossible to unsee them. Susan had always been the kind of woman who kept everything together. She had stood by Daniel's side for over 20 years, playing the role of the perfect wife, the dedicated spouse of the town's beloved pastor. She had helped build his reputation, managing their home, hosting church events, and supporting his ministry every step of the way. But now something felt off. The late-night phone calls that he took in the other room, the unexplained absences, the empty look in his eyes when he came home from the church. At first, she told herself it was nothing, just the stress of work, the demands of the congregation. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. One night as she lay in bed, Daniel beside her, she listened to the soft rise and fall of his breathing. But she couldn't sleep. Her mind was racing, replaying the odd moments from the past few months, moments that didn't add up. Why had he been so distant? Why had he started working late more often? Then something happened that confirmed her worst fears. It was a Friday evening. Susan was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when she heard a soft ding from Daniel's phone on the counter. He was upstairs getting ready for a church meeting, so she reached for the phone without thinking. What she saw made her heart stop. A text message lit up the screen from a number she didn't recognize. The words were simple, but they were enough to send Susan's world crashing down. "I miss you. When can I see you again?" Susan's hands shook as she stared at the message. Who could it be? She knew most of the people in their congregation personally, but this was different. The tone of the message was unmistakable. It wasn't from a parishioner in need of counseling. This was from someone else, someone closer. Her mind raced. Could it be true? Could her husband, the man she had trusted for over 20 years, be having an affair? But she couldn't bring herself to confront him. Not yet. She needed more proof, more than a single text on a screen. Over the next few days, Susan watched Daniel carefully. She paid attention to every word, every move. She noticed how he seemed more preoccupied, how he would smile at her, but his eyes never quite reached hers. She began to follow him. One night, Daniel told her he was heading to the church to prepare for Sunday service. But something about his tone made Susan's skin crawl. So after waiting a few minutes, she grabbed her keys and slipped out the door, following him at a distance. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tailed his black Cadillac down the winding streets of Briarwood. He didn't go to the church. Susan's grip tightened on the steering wheel as she watched Daniel pull into a secluded parking lot by the river. A place they had never gone together. A place that didn't fit with the image of the man she thought she knew. He sat in the car for a few moments, then stepped out. And that's when she saw her, Emily Harding. The girl looked nervous, glancing around as she approached Daniel. Susan's stomach dropped as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The secret late-night calls, the text message, the distance. It wasn't stress. It wasn't work. It was Emily. She watched in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. How could he? How could the man she had built her life around betray her like this? But she wasn't going to confront him here. Not yet. This betrayal deserved something more. Intimate. That night, as Daniel walked through the door of their home, Susan was waiting. The air in the house felt different, thicker, almost suffocating. Susan sat in the dimly lit living room, her hands folded neatly in her lap. But her mind was anything but calm. Her heart raced beneath the surface of her cold exterior, the images of what she had seen earlier playing on a loop in her mind. Emily, young, vulnerable, pregnant. Her husband, smiling at her, speaking to her in hushed tones as if their secret was sacred. The betrayal was too much. She didn't bother with small talk. Her voice cut through the silence like a blade. Who is she? Daniel froze in the doorway, his keys jangling in his hand before he set them on the table. For a moment, he didn't move. The tension in the room was palpable. This was the confrontation he had been dreading. What are you talking about? His voice was controlled, but Susan knew better. There was a slight tremor in his words, a hesitation, the kind that only comes from guilt. She wasn't buying it. Emily. Her voice was sharper this time, more venomous. The girl you've been sneaking around with, the one you've been meeting behind my back, the one who's carrying your child. Daniel's face turned ashen. He knew the truth was out. Susan stood up slowly, her movements deliberate. Every step she took toward him was filled with the weight of years of love, loyalty, and now betrayal. How long had he thought he could keep this from her? How long did you think you could keep this up? Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but the fury in her eyes burned hotter than her words. Did you really think you could hide something like this from me? From God? The room was charged with tension. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but the lies wouldn't come out. For the first time in their marriage, he was at a loss for words. Susan didn't let him off the hook. "I saw you," she hissed, her hands trembling with rage. "I followed you. I saw everything." Her eyes narrowed as she watched her husband struggle to regain control of the situation, but there was no more controlling her. The perfect pastor, the man who had stood at the pulpit for years, preaching about faith, family, and morality. And here he was, caught in his own web of lies. Daniel finally spoke. "It's not what you think." His words were weak, the lie barely formed. He knew there was no way out of this. "Not what I think." Susan's voice cracked, the emotion behind her words finally breaking free. "You've lied to me, to the church, to everyone who trusted you." She took a step closer, her voice rising with each accusation. "And you've ruined that poor girl's life. How could you?" Daniel took a step back, his hands raised as if to calm her down. "Susan, please, I can explain." But she didn't want to hear it anymore. "Explain?" Susan scoffed, her voice bitter. "You've been living a lie, Daniel. You've been sneaking around with a girl half your age while preaching about morality to the rest of us. You disgust me." Her words cut deep, but the truth was sharper. For the first time in their marriage, Susan saw her husband for what he truly was, a coward. But what Daniel didn't realize was that Susan wasn't finished yet. She had been humiliated, betrayed, and lied to for too long. And now she was going to make sure everyone knew exactly who her husband was. "Do you even know what you've done?" she asked, her voice soft but seething with anger. "Do you have any idea how far this has gone?" Daniel's face paled further. He didn't know. He didn't know that Emily was about to break too. He didn't know that the storm was just beginning. Emily Harding had been living in a fantasy. For months, she had clung to every word Pastor Daniel Moore had said to her. The whispered promises of a future together, the secret meetings, the stolen moments that felt like they were meant to be. In her mind, she was the exception, the one person who had managed to capture the heart of a man everyone looked up to. But that fantasy was about to unravel in the most devastating way. It was a late afternoon when Emily received an anonymous text message. "You're not the only one." Her heart skipped a beat. What did that mean? Who had sent it? At first, she tried to brush it off, convincing herself it was a mistake. But the pit in her stomach told her something was wrong. She couldn't ignore the gnawing suspicion that had been growing inside her. What was Pastor Moore hiding? Later that evening, Emily made a decision that would change everything. She drove to his house, her mind racing with questions. As she approached the grand Victorian home, her hands trembling on the steering wheel, she spotted something she wasn't prepared for. Through the large bay windows, she saw Daniel. But he wasn't alone. He was with Susan, and they were arguing. Emily parked down the street, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched the scene unfold. Susan's face was red with fury, her voice loud enough to echo through the quiet night air. Emily couldn't hear every word, but she caught pieces that sent ice through her veins. "Pregnant? How could you? I know everything." Emily's blood ran cold. She felt lightheaded, her world spinning as she realized the awful truth. Pastor Moore wasn't going to leave his wife. He never had any intention of doing so. Everything he had told her had been a lie. The man she thought loved her had been playing her from the beginning. How could she have been so blind? All the promises, all the whispered words, they had all been empty, and now she was alone, pregnant and betrayed. Emily's vision blurred with tears as she gripped the steering wheel, trying to steady her breathing. But something else was boiling up inside her. anger. She had trusted him. She had given him everything, and now he had taken it all away. Emily's life was spiraling out of control, and she felt trapped by her pregnancy, by his lies, and by the terrible reality that she had no way out. But Emily wasn't the type to back down. Not anymore. She was done being the victim, done being manipulated. She wasn't going to let Pastor Moore walk away from this unscathed. Emily had a plan, a desperate, dangerous plan. She had tried to play by the rules, but now, all bets were off. But what she didn't realize was that Susan Moore had plans of her own, and neither woman was about to back down. The air in Briarwood felt thick, like the calm before a storm. Inside the Grand Moore mansion, tension brewed between Daniel and Susan. Their once perfect home, now a pressure cooker ready to explode. But outside, another storm was gathering. Emily had spent the entire night replaying every moment of her relationship with Pastor Moore. Every lie, every promise, every betrayal. And now she had made her decision. The next morning, Emily drove straight to the church. Her hands were clenched on the wheel, her eyes narrowed with determination. She wasn't here to pray. She was here for revenge. She was done waiting for Pastor Moore to do the right thing. Now she would force him to face the truth. Meanwhile, inside the mansion, Susan was losing control. After confronting Daniel, she had spent the night tossing and turning, consumed by the images of her husband with another woman. A girl, really. She couldn't get the words out of her head. Pregnant. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was physical. A new life was growing from the wreckage of her marriage, and that was something Susan couldn't live with. That morning, as she poured her coffee, she stared at the empty chair across from her at the dining table. Daniel had left early, claiming to be at the church, but she knew better now. His words meant nothing. The man she had loved for 2 decades had been lying to her for years. Her husband wasn't the man she thought he was, and neither was she. Susan took a deep breath and stood up from the table. She had made her decision too. She walked slowly toward the bedroom, her footsteps heavy on the polished wooden floors. Inside the closet, hidden behind a row of winter coats, was the lockbox. Her fingers trembled slightly as she punched in the code. The box clicked open, revealing Daniel's old revolver, his service weapon from years ago. She had never touched it before, but today was different. Today, she wasn't going to be the woman who stayed silent, but she wasn't the only one coming for Daniel. At the church, Emily burst through the doors. The building was empty, the early morning sunlight casting eerie shadows through the stained glass windows. Her footsteps echoed down the aisle as she marched toward Pastor Moore's office. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She was angry. She was done being used. Pastor Moore sat at his desk, oblivious to what was coming. But he was about to get the shock of his life. 2 women, 1 man, and a secret that could destroy them all. But the question was, who would strike first? Emily threw open the office door. "We need to talk," she demanded, her voice shaking with barely contained rage. Pastor Moore looked up, his face a mask of surprise and fear. He knew this moment would come, but not like this. Before he could respond, Susan was already on her way to the church. The revolver sat heavy in her purse, her mind racing with dark thoughts. She was going to end this once and for all, but neither woman knew just how far this confrontation would go, and someone wasn't going to make it out alive. Pastor Daniel Moore sat frozen in his office, staring at Emily as she stood in the doorway, her face twisted with rage. He could feel his carefully constructed world slipping out of his control. The secret was out. Emily wasn't backing down. "I'm not leaving until you tell me the truth," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You lied to me. You used me. And now I'm pregnant with your child, and you're just going to throw me away?" Pastor Moore tried to regain his composure, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. "Emily, we can work this out. You don't have to do this. I'll take care of you. Just give me some time." His words sounded hollow even to him, but Emily wasn't buying it anymore. She stepped further into the office, her hands shaking. "Time? Time for what? For you to keep lying to everyone? To your wife? To the entire church?" Little did they know, Susan was already at the church. She parked her Lexus behind the building, out of sight, and quietly made her way inside. the revolver still hidden in her purse. Her heart pounded in her chest as she walked through the empty corridors. She knew where she was going. She knew who she was coming for. Back in the office, Emily's anger reached a breaking point. She had been manipulated, lied to, and now her entire life was about to be ruined because of him. "You're a coward, Daniel. You promised me everything, and now you're just trying to make this all disappear." Pastor Moore stood up from his desk, trying to control the situation. "Emily, please, let's be rational about this. I never meant to hurt you." But his voice faltered. He could feel the walls closing in. And then, the door creaked open. Susan stood there, her face expressionless, her hand wrapped around the handle of her purse. She didn't need to say a word. The look in her eyes said it all. She had heard everything. Emily turned, her eyes widening in shock. She hadn't expected this. "Susan," she stammered, taking a step back. This wasn't part of the plan. But Susan wasn't looking at Emily. Her eyes were locked on her husband. The silence in the room was suffocating. "How long?" Susan's voice was calm, eerily calm, as she took a step into the office. "How long have you been lying to me? How long have you been making a fool of me, of our family?" Pastor Moore tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. "Susan, Save it." Her voice cut through the air like a blade. "I already know. Everything. I've known for weeks." Emily's heart raced as she looked between them. This was getting out of control. She hadn't expected Susan to confront them like this. What was she going to do? "You betrayed me." Susan's voice cracked and she reached into her purse. "You betrayed our marriage, our vows. You betrayed God." And then, in a flash, she pulled the revolver from her purse. The room exploded in chaos. "Susan, no!" Pastor Moore shouted, raising his hands defensively. Emily screamed, stumbling backward into the corner of the room. But Susan wasn't aiming at Daniel. In that split second, her hands shook, her mind racing. This was it. This was the moment that would change everything. But before she could pull the trigger, Daniel lunged at her. The gun fired. A deafening bang echoed through the small office, and the room descended into chaos. Emily's screams filled the air as the bullet shattered a nearby window, sending shards of glass raining down. In the struggle, the revolver fell to the floor, spinning out of Susan's hands, and that's when everything spiraled completely out of control. Emily, acting on pure instinct, dove for the gun, but Susan wasn't done yet, and neither was Daniel. The gun lay on the floor, inches from Emily's trembling hands. Her mind was racing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Everything had spiraled out of control in the blink of an eye, and now she had a choice to make. Susan lunged for the gun, but Emily was faster. Her fingers wrapped around the cold metal as she scrambled to her feet, her back against the wall, the weapon shaking in her grip. Her heart pounded in her ears. Daniel stood frozen, his hands still raised in front of him. His face was a mix of fear and desperation as he stared at the gun pointed directly at him. "Emily, put it down," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "You don't want to do this." But Emily didn't move. She couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. All she could feel was the weight of the gun in her hand and the suffocating betrayal that had led her to this moment. This man of God, had ruined her life. And now here they were, all of them trapped in this sick, twisted mess. "You lied to me," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You told me you loved me. You promised me everything. But it was all a lie." Susan, still on the floor, reached out toward Emily, her voice pleading. "Emily, don't do this." She was no longer the cold, calculating woman who had walked into the church that morning. Now she was just another victim of her husband's lies. For a moment, the room was silent, and then Emily did something no one expected. She turned the gun on herself. "No!" Daniel screamed, stepping forward, but it was too late. Emily's finger hovered on the trigger, her eyes filled with tears. She couldn't see any way out of this. Her entire life had been destroyed. By him, by his lies, by the false promises of a future that would never come. "I don't have anything left," she sobbed, her hands shaking uncontrollably. But before she could pull the trigger, Susan grabbed her. With a sudden, desperate move, Susan threw herself at Emily, knocking the gun out of her hands. The weapon clattered to the floor, skidding across the room. The struggle was frantic, chaotic, and in the madness, another shot rang out. This time, it wasn't Emily. It wasn't Susan. It was Daniel. Pastor Moore collapsed to the floor, his hands clutching his stomach, blood pouring from the wound. His face twisted in pain, and for the first time, the mask he had worn for so long was gone. The powerful, manipulative man who had once controlled everything now lay broken, gasping for air. Susan stood over him, the revolver back in her hand. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock at what she had just done. But in that moment, there was no turning back. Daniel Moore, the man who had ruined so many lives, was gone. Emily sank to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. The weight of everything hit her like a tidal wave. The betrayal, the lies, the pregnancy, the murder. Susan dropped the gun, her hands shaking. The room was silent, except for the sound of Emily's broken cries and the slow fading breaths of the man who had once controlled both their lives. In the aftermath, Briarwood would never be the same. The small town, once quiet and peaceful, would be rocked by the scandal of Pastor Daniel Moore's death and the twisted web of lies he had woven. The investigation revealed everything: the affair, the pregnancy, the money, and the gun that Susan had pulled in a desperate act of revenge. But the question remained: was it truly self-defense, or had Susan planned it all along? The town would never know for sure. As for Emily, her life would never return to normal. She disappeared from the town not long after the funeral, leaving behind only whispers and rumors. Some say she left the country, starting a new life far away from the ghosts of her past. Others say she never really escaped, that the weight of what happened that day still haunts her. And Susan? She served her time, but many believed her true punishment was living with the knowledge of what she had done and what her husband had done to them both. In the end, no one won. Lives were shattered, trust was destroyed, and the consequences of Pastor Moore's betrayal echoed through the town for years to come. A man of God, brought down by his own sins, and the people he hurt left to pick up the pieces of the destruction he caused. But as the years passed, one question remained: did Emily really escape? Or was she just another victim of a man who thought he could control everything, even the truth?